Three, two, one, here we go. RAINMAN'S Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey everybody, it's the Rain Man. I want to welcome back Joe Connell. Joe and I had a conversation last year about Irish history over the last 100 years or so since the Irish War of Independence in 1916, and it was just a fascinating conversation. Joe is in the process of finishing up another book that we're going to touch on a little bit at the end of this conversation. But I wanted to have Joe back on primarily to talk about Brexit. That whole thing, it seems like it was finalized a couple of weeks ago. And what I find super interesting is I think Ireland is the only country within that whole EU complex where this situation is taking place. And that is within Ireland, within the Republic of Ireland, there still is a portion of that territory that's still controlled by England. So it's a very fascinating situation. And I was hoping to kind of get your take, Joe, on how how Brexit came around, and then B, how you see that impacting Ireland in that particular instance. So first off, welcome back and Happy New Year. How are you?
Same as well to you. Happy New Year to you, Brian, and thank you so very much for having me back. The A part of this with regard to Brexit doesn't start with just a few years ago, and it's very important to understand this, I think. Sometimes I look at history and I think, all right, maybe I'm getting a little bit too involved in it, but I think we have to take a look at the history of Europe and see exactly how the European Union started, because it's extremely important as to how Britain then decided to leave the European Union. We could go back as far as you want to, I don't know, but let's start and take a look really at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 at the end of World War I.
Okay.
Because it's extraordinarily important as to how Europe would develop right after that. At that Treaty of Versailles, there were really kind of a big four. There's the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy. But the three, the United States with Wilson, Great Britain with Lloyd George, and France with Clemenceau, were really the ones who kind of brought about how the treaty was going to work. France wanted to make sure that there was going to be some kind of a barrier between them and Germany. They looked at Britain and said, you have the English Channel. They looked at the United States and said, you have the Atlantic Ocean. We need some kind of a barrier. So they wanted to take everything they could from Germany and really make it a very harsh treaty.
Right.
John Maynard Keynes, was the great economist, was a British economist, and he was part of the British delegation at the time, and he called this a Carthaginian peace, the kind of a peace that Rome brought on Carthage, where you take everything, and you leave them with nothing, and you make sure they can never fight you again. And that's what he thought this was going to be. Great Britain had as its primary thing to have sort of a balance of power in Europe. They didn't want France to be very much on the top. They didn't want Germany either, but they wanted a balance of power. So Lloyd George was looking at it that way. President Wilson he wasn't in office for very long when he went over there. And I think we take a look at Wilson and we think him of a very elderly looking, a real gentlemanly kind of a man, but he was naive at this time. He was not a diplomat. He hadn't really gone into things very, very well. And he came up with the idea of self-determination. Self-determination for various countries, etc. He wanted to have the League of Nations. He wanted to have some sort of a balance of power in Europe as well. And that's the way it went. So the French wanted to take the Ruhr Valley. They wanted to take the Saar. They wanted to take Germany's ability to do anything at all. And remember, when you take away the ability to make war equipment, you also take away the ability to make pipes and bridges and everything else. So it was really a very, very onerous kind of a thing. Wilson came in and he had these very idealistic ideas, and I don't think he was very good at putting them across. When he went to France first, for the first time he went there with regard to the treaty, he was very, very welcome. He took a break, came back to the United States in the middle of it, he went back, and he wasn't welcome quite so much because people thought his idealism went way, way beyond pragmatism. So I think when we're going to start here, we have to kind of break down that treaty just a little bit more to see where Europe was at the end of 1919.
And it's interesting that you talk about that, because Maynard Keynes, who wanted it to be Carthaginian, essentially you reap what you sow, because that's what Hitler used as some of his major motivation for starting World War II, basically, was to get back at them for all that.
It was, and we're going to talk about the treaty and where Europe was at this particular time, and some of the things that happened, because it led to the things that you mentioned right there. It led to Hitler and that sort of a thing. Remember, Germany had no role in these negotiations. They were told to show up when they're done, sign, or the war starts again tomorrow. So they had absolutely no role. As a matter of fact, the German prime minister, when he was told this, resigned, and they had to find somebody around to go in there and do this. It was a very onerous kind of a treaty.
Right.
There was what was called a German war guilt clause, in which the Germans had to admit that they were wrong for everything, and they had to pay for all the damage suffered for all the civilians in Italy, in Britain, and in France. Now, this amounted to about $41 billion at the time, about $450 billion now,
Yeah.
which is a massive amount. It doesn't sound so much now, but go back 100 years, and $400 billion was all the money in the world. John Rockefeller never saw anywhere close to $8 billion, so you can see exactly how much this was. They end up paying, this is very important, they paid those reparations, and they could be taken in either cash or in kind. So if you didn't have the gold, Germany, we'll be happy to take this steel plant.
Right.
And that's what the French did, is they took things in kind, or this telephone making plant. We'll take this kind of thing like this. The reparations were paid until the middle 30s, when, as you suggest, Adolf Hitler said, we're not going to pay those anymore. And in the 1950s, those reparations started to be paid again by West Germany. The last World War I reparation was paid in October of 2010.
I did not know that.
That's how harsh this treaty was.
Wow.
When you look at all the money that was paid, all the things that were taken, it was incredible.
Yeah, that is
At
amazing.
the same time, you've got what was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This is going to be real interesting to you, Brian, because you fought there.
Yeah.
A man by the name of Mark Sykes and Francois Picot, the British and the French, decided how they were going to break up the Middle East. And they did. And they simply laid a big map without any countries on it, on a big table, and they said, here's how we're going to have the Middle East. And Mark Sykes very famously once said, I'm going to draw a line from the E in Accra, which is on the coast, which is now part of Israel,
Right.
to the K in Kirkuk, which is in Iraq. That's the border. Had nothing to do with anything. It merely was a line that was drawn across there.
Yeah.
But this was also, I think, in my view, a very racist treaty, in the sense that there were mandates that were here. If you take a look at the Middle East, we talk about that, the parties to the treaty determined that some of those lower countries did not have the ability to administer themselves. So we will set up a mandate by which we, the developed countries, will administer them and teach them how to do it. That's a very racist, paternalistic idea, but that's how it worked. So France got what became Syria, and Britain got what became Iraq. In Iraq, when they put this together, they took three distinct, different provinces and they put them together. These had nothing to do with anything before this, but they did. The provinces of Baghdad, Mosul, and what was the other one? Basra.
Yeah.
That's it. Baghdad, Mosul, and Basra. Now, you know this. You're smiling because that's where you fought.
Right.
But more importantly, I would suggest to you that everybody in the world in 2020 has a much better idea of those three names than anybody in the world did in 1920.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is that it was basically the genesis of all the modern conflict, because you have the Kurds, who are essentially a completely different population than the people in southern Iraq, yet they're forced to interact with each other, and they've hated each other forever. So inside of the new boundaries, you have tribes, for a lack of a better way to describe it, that hated each other and have forever.
They took no consideration of that.
Yeah.
When they broke down Central and Eastern Europe into all the countries that formed the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, they did the same thing. They broke them down into countries that survived until the end of the 20th century only because they were part of the Russian influence. And when the Russian influence went apart, those countries went apart, and that's how we have now Croatia and Serbia and all the rest of these things.
Right.
This is all as a result of that. Remember, too, that Japan fought in the First World War on the side of the Allies. They were just coming into influence around the world. They had just won the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. They had taken parts of Manchuria and Mongolia, and they came to the treaty negotiations in Paris thinking that, well, maybe we're going to get a little bit of a divvy up here in the Far East as well. Look what the British and the French are doing to the Middle East. We can get some of those former German colonies, and we can get some of the raw materials we need. They didn't. There was a couple things here. Not only were they ignored diplomatically, but they were ignored socially. When the French would get together, they talk about the two Japanese delegates over there, the two little Mikado boys. Or when they would have a reception, they wouldn't invite the Japanese. And then there was an ethnic equality clause that was supposed to go into the treaty that the Japanese wanted very, very much because they knew they were getting short shrift here.
Yeah.
That clause failed by 2 votes. The United States and Australia voted against it. Woodrow Wilson was in the chair that day, and he determined that all votes have to be unanimous, except for the fact that was the only vote that was determined to be unanimous. There was no ethnic equality at all in this. So you're exactly right. When you take a look at what happened in the far East, when you look at what happened in the Middle East, when you take a look at what happened in Europe, an awful lot of this comes from the Treaty of Versailles. There were problems of ethnic nationalism, like you said, with the Kurds. They simply weren't resolved. We're having a tough time resolving them today, but we're not drawing lines on a map from this city to that city.
Right.
This was supposed to be the war that ends all wars. Remember that. Not only was it not that, but it was problematic. However, as much as the French did this, as harsh as it was, some of the French thought it was not harsh enough. Marshal Foch said, this is not a peace, it's simply an armistice for 20 years. We'll be fighting him again because we didn't take enough away from them.
Wow.
That's
almost
how
like
you
they wanted to wipe Germany off the map.
Brian, when politicians act out of revenge and vengeance at any time, in any way, anywhere, they're going to have a problem with that sooner or later. And that's exactly what happened here. So that's how you have to take a look at what the continent of Europe looked like at that time. Yeah. You know, I saw one of your Rain Man takes a couple of weeks ago with Dow, and she was the Vietnamese lady who was wonderful. And she talked, for example, about Ho Chi Minh being there. He was in Paris at this time. He was actually working as a cook in the Ritz Hotel. He had been working in the United States in Boston in the Parker House as a cook. He went to the convention with other Vietnamese, and he said, when we talked to you about this, you said self-determination. Yeah. And Wilson said, that term, self-determination, is the metaphysical tragedy of the time. I should never have said that. Wow. In fact, the very time when he did say that, his Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, wrote him a stinging memo saying you should never have done this. This will never work. We cannot do that. We cannot have self-determination. It simply will not work. Who else went there? The Irish went there, and they were told, nope, you can't talk to them. We're not going to do anything about this. This is not self-determination. Wilson ultimately determined that it was only going to be self-determination if, in fact, it didn't change anything, and you were only going to look at the colonies of the victorious countries, not the ones who had been defeated. So I don't give Wilson very much credit for this, as you can imagine. However, I think that there were these racist kind of things that were done. There were these revenge kind of things that were done. And that's how you have Europe sort of starting to bubble again in 1919 and 1920. When you mention Hitler, he was actually thrown in jail in 1923 because they had already started another revolt in Germany.
Right.
Mussolini became a dictator in 1922. So when you look at very shortly after the Treaty of Versailles, you have a bubbling cauldron in Europe with rampant inflation. You have all kinds of problems. You've got the Japanese who have gone home and said, we're going to get nowhere with the Anglo-Saxons. If we want something, we're going to have to take it ourselves and go from there. Now, this has been very simplistic and a very quick view of the Treaty of Versailles. I don't want this to, you can have a course on this, but that's kind of where I want to start.
Well, and it's all, that's all fascinating, because then you said it there that politicians, when they act out of vengeance, things go sideways in a hurry, and you're actually seeing that present day in America right now. It's after the craziness last week at the Capitol, the Democrats are calling for the heads of Republicans. I mean, it's just, and so that's not going to end well, because history says it never does. And the fact that Wilson, the arrogance of empire, it's just the three of us. This is all, we're only talking about us. Forget the rest of the world. I mean, it's amazing.
And yet they had an opportunity. Yeah. Because at that time in 1919, not only was it Wilson and Orlando and all the rest of these, they had all these people coming from around the world. They had the people from Vietnam. They had the Arabs coming. They had from everywhere. Paris at that time probably had more world leaders and world leaders of the ethnic people around the world than has ever been put together in one place again, ever. They had an opportunity to do this, but I don't think they could go across the ideas of ethnic equality, of racial equality, of revenge, of getting kind of reparations. I don't think they could bring all these together. In the early 20th century, for the most part of the 20th century, the Treaty of Versailles was looked upon as just being horrific. It did lead, many people said, to World War II. I think that that's simplistic. Again, you take a look and you have the market crash in 1929. You've got huge earthquakes in Japan. You've got a lot of things that go into what happened to 1939 for World War II. Yeah. It certainly was one of the major problems of it. Later in the 20th century, a lot of historians started to look back and say, well, maybe because of the times, that was as good as they could have got. I think the pendulum is kind of swinging back now to, no, they should have done more. But it is certainly a situation where you have to look at it, because that was what Europe was at the end of World War I. And it was a mess, and it was just waiting to blow up, and it did, ultimately. When Foch said it's going to be a peace for 20 years, he was right. 1919, 1939, he was right on the money.
And could you almost say the same thing that happened when we established the United Nations after World War II? I mean, because it was almost an identical type of situation where the victors came together to kind of divide up the world and how the world order was gonna go from there on. I mean, it wasn't that far. When did the EU started, what, in the 90s? So it was only 50 years later, right?
Well, let's take a look at the United Nations that you talk about, which is a different term. The League of Nations was the term that was used, of course, in the First World War, or rather in the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. Importantly, extremely importantly, that was Woodrow Wilson's idea. Clemenceau once very famously said, God only gave us 10 commandments and Wilson comes up with 14. How the hell are we supposed to do with this? The fact of the matter is, the League of Nations was the key to Wilson's everything. The United States did not sign the treaty. The United States voted down the League of Nations. Irish American senators voted against it. Most Irish American people were against it. The Americans had to sign different treaties other than the Treaty of Versailles with Germany and with Austria-Hungary later on, because they did not sign this treaty. One of the biggest problems is the United States was not a member of the League of Nations, whereas, of course, it was a member of the United Nations thereafter. And that's where you have a much greater authority in the United Nations than you ever had in the League of Nations. Even though it was kind of successful at the time, it wouldn't have been successful because it didn't have all the players.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. So we get to World War II.
We get to 1945.
Yeah,
we get to the end of World War II.
Right.
Things have changed, thankfully. Concepts have changed, thankfully. Instead of taking reparations and taking every single steel plant you have, we have the Marshall Plan. We go back in and we say we have to build up not only all the countries that were damaged, Germany, Netherlands, France, Britain, etc. We have to help Japan out so they can become economically viable. The way that you have a war-free environment, if you will, is you don't have people constantly trying to take back one thing or another. So in 1945, we had the Marshall Plan, and we have a great deal of money going in there. But the people had a different attitude as well. Again, I give credit to the French foreign minister in about 1950, a man by the name of Robert Schulman, because he had an idea and they brought it together. And that was the European Coal and Iron Consortium, founded in 1951. That is the seminal moment for the EU. It had 6 members. It had France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. So you have winners, you have losers, and you have neutral countries from the middle. But you have the middle, you have that heartland, you have the Ruhr, you have the Rhineland, you have the ability for each of the countries to create their own iron and coal, and you're not fighting over it and that sort of thing. That was the real genesis of the EU, was the European Coal and Iron Consortium, 1951. And I give credit to Robert Schulman for coming up with that idea.
And
The
then
Treaty of Rome, a little bit later in 1957, was what established the European Economic Community. That was called the Common Market, and that is the actual beginning of the EU. Again, the same 6 people were or same 6 countries rather, were the ones there. Italy, France, West Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. So
well,
that's
because
the actual start of the EU, 1957.
yeah, because at that time the Soviet Union had started gobbling up some of the eastern countries, right? Like Poland and eventually Czechoslovakia and all those. Had they started that push yet? So that
That push started about January of 1945, just as soon as the Germans came across the border. And in fact, it was a kind of thing where it caused great problems. Again, you've got NATO on one side, you've got the Warsaw Pact on the other side from a military point of view, but the EU was really established, the European Economic Community. Economics was the key for all of this going back to the start. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So you've got 51, the coal and iron, and in 57, you've got really the true start of the European Economic Community in the Treaty of Rome.
And then, so fast forward now to when
Not very far.
Official EU is set up.
Not very far. You fast forward to 1963, and Britain applies to the economic community and is turned down. Then, as now, all of the applications have to be unanimous. France voted against Britain. But I would suggest to you it really wasn't France so much as it was Charles de Gaulle. Because Charles de Gaulle said Britain's involved with a great many foreign areas. Now that's pretty absurd when you take a look at France and your conversation a couple of weeks ago with Dow, and you take a look at France and Algeria, and it's pretty absurd for France to say this. Most people think that, in fact, de Gaulle didn't feel that he was given the kind of respect that he should have been given during World War II when he was in Britain, that he was not the head of state. You know, they had a great many kings there, presidents there who had come there. That was where they were staying during the war. That was not what de Gaulle was, but de Gaulle felt that he was not given that respect. So in 1963, de Gaulle turned it down. And in fact, they could not join the EU until 1973 when they did, when de Gaulle was dead. Now, you're going to see here as we go on, individuals here who have a great sway upon what happens, and while they're in office, it may or may not happen, and then when they leave office, things change. So de Gaulle would be the first one. He said no, and then when he left, in fact, the British and the Irish and Denmark were able to join the EU, the EEC at that time in 1963. And from that time, that's when Britain, the United Kingdom, was a member of the European Economic Community, and then the EU as it went on from that on.
Interesting. Why did it take Ireland so long to join? Was England blocking them, or was?
No, England was not blocking them. As a matter of fact, they were probably applying together, that sort of a thing. But
Gotcha.
They were a very small country, and de Gaulle wasn't going to let anybody in. But don't think that this is now a straight line. We've kind of gotten a very curvy line so far from Versailles. We've gotten to 1963, and the answer is no. We got to 1973, and the answer is yes. And we're going to talk about Brexit, right? Well, we could talk about Brexit in 1975, because that was when the first vote was held in the United Kingdom as to whether they were going to stay in the EU or not. The very first one, 1975. 2.5 years after they're in, they're taking a vote to see if we want to stay in.
And why is that? Was it just, was England was still in such a depressed?
You know, I don't think that people understood it. They didn't know. We must understand that they, from the very beginning, entered it for transactional purposes. They entered it for this economics. They did not buy into the concept of a federal union, a federal Europe. They never did. And so they were looking at it transactionally. And in fact, in 1975, it passed. And it passed very easily. It passed about 64% to 35%. Very, very easy. We see people here starting to come up again. One of the leaders of the stay in the EU movement was Margaret Thatcher. Extremely important. She was not prime minister. She was a member of parliament, but she was very much of a Europhile at the time for transactional purposes, and she wanted to stay in, and she was a leader of this. She didn't become prime minister until far after that, about 1970, I think, late 70s, 78, I believe, or 1990s, when she finally became prime minister, and she had a great many problems with it. But from the very beginning, you have to kind of take a look at this rocky road that the UK is on. It's not a straight line. They're first of all told no, then they're told yes, then they have to have a vote, and then they start taking a look at things. They were in it transactionally. They were not in it for any kind of a federal union. They did not want that, and you go from there.
Wow. And so during that time in the 70s, you also have, kind of tying Ireland into this, that's kind of the height of the IRA going after England, right?
It is indeed. If you talk about the troubles in Northern Ireland, really the start, I guess you'd make it in 1969. So you're right, the 70s, it was full on. It was going that sort of a way. Britain was still, Margaret Thatcher was a conservative. She was very much in charge of her party at this time. She changed. She kind of morphed around, but so did the EU. And you have to take a look at this. I mentioned earlier Robert Schuman. There was another Frenchman by the name of Jacques Delors who became the president of the European Commission about this time. And he was very, very much in terms of federalism. They even talked sometimes about the United States of Europe and things like that. That term, United States of Europe, absolutely drove Thatcher crazy. She hated that concept. She did not want that at all. And so if you look at 1985, then we're looking here, we have what's called the Schengen Agreement. That was where most of these European countries said that we'll have no more borders, we'll have no more internal controls. You'll be able to go from Austria to France, you'll be able to go to Germany, Italy, you won't have to go through controls. Ireland and the UK did not sign up to this, and they never have. And Margaret Thatcher said, no, we need borders to control immigration. We need borders for security.
Right.
So again, you're taking a look at not too long after she's there, where you start seeing a little bit of gravel in the thing. She's changing a little bit and going a few different ways. You had a number of countries, about 20 countries who came into the EU in the 80s and 90s, Spain, Portugal, Greece. A lot of these countries came in, and they all came in on unanimous votes. And they all signed up to the Schengen Agreement with the exception of Ireland and the UK. When they came in, they did so. So that's how all this thing came up, and that's where you have the EU sort of at the end of the 80s. And then you have Margaret Thatcher, who is constantly saying, we're paying too much. I don't know if we're getting very much. I don't know what's going on. And she gave an extremely important speech at Bruges, Belgium, at the College of Europe one time in 1988. And in this speech, what she said was, we signed up for economics. We did not sign up, except for enterprise, we did not sign up to give up our sovereignty or our borders. We do not want you to change to be a federalist kind of a thing. We don't want the United States of Europe. And then she had, I love the use of language. She had one thing, I just want to note it here. She said, we should not become ossified by endless regulation. Occupied by endless regulation. It's a brilliant turn of phrase. But her whole point in this was not anti-Europe, it was anti-federalist. But it was not taken that way. It was taken anti-Europe. And in fact, she had problems not only with the European, that Jacques Delors I mentioned earlier, he got an advance copy of the speech and he refused to show up. She had problems with Geoffrey Howe, who was her own foreign minister. And in fact, a couple of years later, she was turned out as prime minister, a great deal of which was she lost the confidence of the people at that time. So by 1990, She's out, John Major is in, and she now becomes even a harsher critic, even though she's out of office, a harsher critic of the EU's federalist kind of a concept. The Maastricht Treaty, which really made the single market, went into effect in 1992. This eliminated tariffs. You could sell things back and forth, and it was just absolutely tremendous. You put your stuff on a truck in Dublin. You put it on a ferry to Britain. That truck would go across to France, and you'd sell something in France. You'd fill back up with cheese in France, go across the land bridge to Britain, and you come to Ireland. You didn't have customs duties, didn't have treaties, didn't have limitations, and that's the way it was. And that was the Maastricht Treaty in 1992.
Did that also usher in the euro as well?
Well, the euro came a little bit later than that. It was the euro, I think, went into effect about 1997, but it actually started being traded about 2002. Now, remember here again, one of the things that happened is that the UK did not sign up to the euro. So if you go to Britain, you still use the pound. If you go to Northern Ireland, you still use the pound. And to this day, that's still it. They never signed up to the euro, and they never wanted to. This was a part and parcel of we want to be in there and sell. I think there was an attitude of we want to sell Jaguars there and we want to buy Mercedes here, but we don't want all these regulations in the middle. We don't want that. And I think that's kind of how it worked.
What's fascinating about that, set aside the challenges that pop up when you are traveling in Ireland, because the euro in Southern Ireland and then Northern Ireland is the pound. But I mean, you're seeing over the last.
The other thing to remember too is, and I hope you remember this when you drive, it's kilometers in Ireland and it's miles in the north.
Yep.
So if you're driving down the road and somebody comes behind you because you're going way too fast, it's because you haven't made the calculation to change your speed.
That's right. That's right. I forgot about that actually. But you also, I mean, the modern issues that the EU is having right now, that this history is fascinating because it kind of brings it into perspective. What is it, 5, 6, 7 years ago when Greece basically defaulted, and so you have this dichotomy of states within the EU. You got the Germans, you've got the French, and all the real high-powered economies, and then you have the Mediterranean economies that are kind of lagging way behind. Just the cultures are totally different. You had the Germans are pissed off that they've got to bail out the Greeks for taking 2 months off in the summertime from working, that sort of thing. And then even more recent, the issue with the immigrants. And that's something that Margaret Thatcher that's actually her ability to force it out of that's amazing, because isn't it right now they're basically forcing countries to take X amount of these immigrants that are coming across the Mediterranean.
It's true, but let's back up just 1 second. It wasn't just Greece that got bailed out. Remember, it was Greece and Spain and Italy and Portugal and Ireland. And it was important to note that these were determined to be loans, not grants, because the EU Constitution does not allow the EU as an entity to grant money. So all that money that was paid to Ireland to bail out their banks and that sort of a thing, and it wasn't bailing out the bank shareholders, it was bailing out the lenders, it has to be paid back. And it's 60 billion euro, which, now we have COVID, which is a huge problem, and it's going to be a huge problem economically. They're still coming out from under that. So you've got economic problems over there, that's true, and you've got real problems that continue. When we talk about the history of this, I think it's important to note that in 2012, the EU received the Nobel Peace Prize. And they received it not for 2012, but for the previous 90 years, really, for putting everything together and keeping it together. So, in fact, there were different kinds of wars and things that go along with it, because they recognized human rights. They recognized the things that went on ever since World War II and 1951 when they first started along. So that was very, very much the situation, and it kind of went along. They had the problems at the end of the 2010s because of the economic situation throughout the world. And then you come just about to 2016. In the beginning of 2016, you have the EU, which says, or rather Britain, which says, we got problems here. How are we going to settle this? And David Cameron, who was the the prime minister went over to the EU and asked for some concessions. And in fact, he got a great many concessions. He got concessions that said, we're not going to just have a single currency. They got concessions with regard to immigrants coming in and not giving them immediate welfare benefits and that sort of thing. He got concessions with regard to competitiveness. He got concessions that he thought were okay. Whenever you go and negotiate, you never get everything you want. The British didn't get everything they wanted. The EU probably thought they gave up more than they should have. We've got an awkward situation with Great Britain that's gone on for some period of time. They're in, they're out, whatever else. Remember, they started the UKIP, which is the United Kingdom Independence Party, was established in 1993. They wanted out all the way since then. So you've got all this going on. And when Cameron came back in January of 2016, he thought, I believe, that this is as good a deal as we're going to get. And now is a good time to go to ask the British for a vote on the EU, because we now are in a pretty good position. We can say, look, we've got all these concessions from the EU, and we're in a good position going forward. And so a vote was called for June of 2016. It was a very vituperative kind of a election, but all elections are. Everybody says the other guy's lying. Everybody says, you know, this is wrong and all that sort of thing. So it was. So it was passed to leave, but very, very closely. 52% leave, 48% say remain. Scotland said remain. Wales said leave. England said leave, and Northern Ireland said remain. But at that particular time, John Major said, I'm sorry, I can't continue in this. Theresa May, about a month later, became the prime minister. She lasted for 3 years, and she couldn't get a deal through the British Parliament. So she lost her position, and Boris Johnson came in, and he finally did get a deal through the British Parliament. And then, in fact, he got a deal with the UK. Went into effect on January 1st, 2020, and then the transitional period was just over here, December 31st, with a trade agreement on 2021. And we can talk now about, after all of this history, as to how did we get here? What does this mean? But that's where it was, and it was not. It was a rocky road. It was a path that kind of went up and down and back and forth. But it was very important to take a look at why the EU is so important to Europe. It's an extraordinarily part of the whole world right now, and it deserved the Peace Prize then in 2012, I believe, and it deserves a great deal of credit right now as well.
So, and it's interesting that this has been a fascinating history. A lot of this stuff I either had forgotten or didn't even know about. But in 2016, you also have the rise of Nigel Farage, who was the UKIP representative, and since then he's been a huge proponent of Brexit. And is that kind of going back to the Margaret Thatcher ideas? England or Britain didn't want to be governed by this bureaucratic entity out of Brussels. They didn't want to be told what to do, essentially, right?
To a great degree, yes. And there are reasons. There's the sovereignty issue. In many ways, a lot of the British people in the South just had sort of a pox on all of you. Let's get out of here. I think immigration was a huge issue. That was one of Nigel Farage's primary issues. I also think it was the regulation. Even if you talk to people in Ireland, for example, who are very, very much proponents of the EU and have benefited tremendous about it, they all gripe about the regulations that go along. We all gripe about governmental regulation. If anybody has a business here in the United States, they hate OSHA. They absolutely hate OSHA. It doesn't make any difference that they're saving them lives, they're helping them out, all that sort of thing. They hate them. We always hate governmental regulations. We want to do what we want to do and how we want to do it. So there were some governmental regulations. Remember Margaret Thatcher's great line, ossified by increased regulations. That was one of the major problems. And so they thought that they could get out of that and they can do the things for themselves. Time will tell.
Yeah, and I personally can't see this ever happening, just because Britain is such a major player in Europe. But the threats from the EU of getting rid of trade agreements and that sort of thing, I can't see that happening with how interconnected everything is. So to me, it doesn't seem like it's that. If they were to leave, it wouldn't be that catastrophic for
them. Full disclosure, I never liked Brexit. I never really exactly understood Brexit. But in fact, they're gone, and you're seeing the things now. We talk so much about the rather trite phrase, the devil's in the details. We're seeing so many things happen right now that were there. remember Donald Rumsfeld, who I don't think very much of as a Secretary of Defense, but he came up with a couple of lines, which again, I love language. He came up with known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And we're seeing now some of the unknown unknowns that we had that weren't there, that weren't negotiated, that weren't thought about. Remember, the concept of EU and Ireland was a massive change. It's not just if you drive around and you see the blue signs and you see the roads and you see all the things that they've done, but it changed the way that they ate, it changed their diet, it changed the availability of fruits and things on a basis. They get easy travel. Students could go to different universities without any particular problem. Professionals had the ability to practice in Britain as well as in France or whatever else. It really had major changes. But now you're starting to see some little areas of change that are not, that some of which were anticipated and some of which were not, that are problematical for Ireland. And I think it's going on. Goods now coming in from Great Britain have to have customs checks in Dublin. So when they pull into Dublin port, they have to go through customs checks there. And there was just an article in the paper last week that 50 to 80% of those trucks that are being stopped are not being stopped maybe because the product is bad, but because they haven't filled out the proper forms. And this is a problem in administration. No matter what you do, it's always the form is there. You know, we've always heard, the job is not done until the paperwork is done kind of thing. That's exactly what's happening right now, particularly in the things going back and forth. You'll have this sort of a thing where we're not sure about, did I fill out the right form or not? Is that problematical? Well, sure it is. If you're getting fresh vegetables from France and all of a sudden your truck is sitting there for 3 days and your vegetables go bad, in fact, you might not be able to sell those. So you've got huge problems with regard to that. The UK was used as a land bridge, as I said to you before. Trucks would leave Ireland, stop in Great Britain, and go through to France. They might not be able to do that now without some kind of custom checks and that sort of a thing. Some EU professionals might not be able to get the same kind of reciprocity in other countries without getting examined again. Where does it come down to? Right now, the EU and the UK will have different rules for medicines and for any kind of medicines to be given, which means that there is a COVID vaccination right now that's okay in Great Britain, but it has not been approved in the EU yet. That's where you might see some little tiny things. Again, who could have anticipated COVID? Who could have anticipated Hitler? Who could have anticipated any of these things? What you're talking about is the unknown unknowns that come back and get you in a certain period. There was a situation last week in the Netherlands where a man from Great Britain who was driving a lorry had his lunch because he was going to be gone for a couple, 3 days. There are problems regarding taking food products from Britain to the EU. His lunch was confiscated. They said, you can't bring in ham and cheese sandwiches. The man says, can you take the ham and the cheese and leave me the bread? And they said, nope, it's all or nothing. So when you're talking about Ireland, I'm certainly not an expert in this, and I'll try and get you to talk to an expert about it. But the fact of the matter is that these are the kind of small things that we think of, but they're the things that have such a great influence on our every single day life that we never would have known. And that's why I think when you take a look at the trade agreement and everything else, remember, what they had in the EU was freedom of passions of services, money, of products, and people. And that's going to stop now. So if you have a Brit who had a home in Spain, they could go there for vacations every winter and that sort of thing. Now, if they're going to stay more than 90 days, they might have to get permission to do so. Yeah. It's a different kind of a world where the little things are probably going to have greater effect upon us than the big things in the economy.
And like you said, especially for Ireland, because in order to get across to continental Europe, they'd have to go through England to get to the tunnel to get over there. So yeah, they get kind of squeezed.
They do. They get squeezed in different ways. And Ireland's trade is a hugely important trade. But the trade back and forth between the UK and Ireland is important. Remember now, in the north, there's what they call a border in the Irish Sea. So the north of Ireland is really following EU rules right now, going down between the Republic and the north. But if products are taken from Belfast to London, then in fact they have to have different custom checks going back and forth, which is driving the unionists crazy, saying we're a part of the United Kingdom. How come we have to have different rules? So this is, again, a problem here. It's not easy. it probably would have been a lot easier in the sense of Ireland and Northern Ireland and these two islands. It would have been easier if Italy left, because you simply have a new border and you go from there. But when you have a border within a border, it's problematical. And I don't think anybody can say right now, certainly I can't, I'm not capable of saying this is how it's going to work out 5 years, 10 years down the road. I always say this, Ryan, I would not live long enough, but I would love to read the book that somebody writes 10 years from now that says this is what happened and this is why, when all the information's really in.
That's fascinating that that Belfast can't even trade with London right now, or they're treated
they
like
can
a
trade,
separate...
but they're having problems. They're having stores that they're saying we can't get the products that we need because of the customs duties and things like this. There's not a tariff, but customs duties are there. You also have some companies who are saying we are not going to sell you even online because we don't know exactly how this is going to work out. It's just a problem right now that's going on. And in this world today, with everything else that's going on, the last thing we need are more little irritants in our life. We just don't need that. So I don't know where this is going to come from.
Wow. Well, what's your take? Do you, having that bureaucratic control over very different countries, is that a good thing? In your opinion?
Well, I think you've got different levels of this. From an economic point of view, yes, it's great to be able to sell Mercedes in this country and sell Peugeots in this country and sell Fiats in this country and sell Jaguars over there. It's great. If you take a look at the Airbus, for example, it's put together with parts in Spain and parts in France and finally put together and they fly out. I think that economically that's great. I think it's fine. Now you're talking about the EU coming up with these regulations. That's problematical. It would be very difficult not to look at that as there are going to be some that aren't, because you're right. The concept of the people is different. I know people in Dublin, for example, who have said the EU says I can't have chairs this close to the street for my sidewalk cafe. That's problematical. And yet I think that overall they can probably overcome that. Then you talk about the EU coming up with its own foreign policy. That might be a little bit more difficult as well. I don't know how that can work out. The EU does not have an army, but they're talking about putting together some kind of a security force. That's going to be problematical. Remember, Ireland is a neutral. Does Ireland have to contribute to this force? Ireland has an army, and they contribute greatly, and it's recognized worldwide as a very important force for peacekeeping for the UN. But if the EU starts to have its own military, what's Ireland's situation that going to be? I don't know the answer to these questions. Then I don't know if anybody does. What I would suggest to you is where it started on enterprise. It started on sales. It started on transactions. It started on property. And then it moved into a lot of other things. And you've got situations where you're saying that this person has been in the country for so long, and so they're eligible for benefits. And some of the countries are saying, we don't like that. We don't want somebody to come here and just get benefits right away. That was, again, one of the concessions that David Cameron negotiated was with regard to that. So people are having this. It's not as exactly that the EU, rather that the UK is the only one arguing, the only one who is argumentative. They might just be the loudest.
Yeah. Are there other, I want to say, and I don't know if it's Germany, but there's got to be other countries that have thought about leaving, right? And have actually publicly said that they would. Am I right? Was Germany one of them, or was that?
I don't think anybody's ever said that they wanted to leave. I think that's the kind of a thing that's said in a speech someplace, and we got to get rid of the EU, just like. But the reason I would say that is they had Article 50, which was the process by which a country could leave, and it was so unknown that even though they know that they have once you invoke Article 50, you have a year to get out. They had no idea what to do. Nobody did. They didn't know what the rules were. They had never anticipated this. They had never come up with this idea. Even back in 2009, I think when they were doing the kinds of bailouts of Greece and everything, the people were saying, well, let's just leave. I don't think that was ever really taken seriously on either the country's part or on the EU's part, because I think they looked at the ramifications of leaving and saying, we don't want to. We get a lot out of this, and we wouldn't get it if we weren't a member of it. Right now, you had 28 countries. Now you've got 27. Think of it, 27 whole countries who are selling products, moving people, and going back and forth. That's a tremendous block, and it's a great block, and it's one that the people have really benefited by.
It's fascinating as you're talking about this. I'm thinking to myself, why do they need, if it's a economic block, why do they need armed forces or a security force? You know, that's actually, it's a fascinating question because I don't see. I mean, obviously you got each of those countries has their own armed forces. Then you got the UN, kind of an umbrella. What would the EU do with an armed force or a security force?
I really don't know. Remember, the EU as a unit did not go into the Far East. The EU as a unit did not go into Bosnia. So individual countries did or did not send troops to those areas,
Right.
but the EU did not. And so I don't know if they're going to be able to pull that off. I think that's one of the things that we talk about more and more federalization. I think Margaret Thatcher would be spinning in her grave thinking of something like that right now. But I don't know where those are going to go. It just, the more and more it gets involved, you start to take a look, and it could be looked upon as being just a one giant entity. But you still have all of these countries with all of their ethnic peoples looking at this differently. It's very difficult to take a look at it. Most of these treaties always have to be passed by all the countries, whether it's Rome or Maastricht or treaties. Ireland did not pass the Lisbon Treaty or the Nice Treaty. And so the EU basically said, I'll tell you what, we're going to go there and we're going to have you vote again. And I guess the thought was, vote until you get it right.
And I have to assume that pisses Ireland off.
Well, some people, the Irish love the EU, and I think they're right to love the EU. But it seems like there's this overbearing kind of entity that says, this is what we're going to want to do. And when you start to distill that and you get down to an office level, or you get somebody who says you can't have your chairs out this close to the road, then all of a sudden you don't like it. The fact that you're buying coffee for that restaurant, that you're buying pastries, that you're buying cheese, that you're buying everything else for that restaurant without any tariffs, that's a pretty good deal. Nothing's ever simple.
No, and that's what I love about your books is you have a great way of making sure to tell people that you got to separate your passions away from the reality on the ground. You can't sugarcoat history. You can't sugarcoat the current situation. So that's why I love your books. One more thing about the whole EU and this entity kind of controlling Europe. You also have the World Economic Forum, and just kind of over my adult life since I got back from the war, very skeptical of these big government entities dictating things from a little ivory tower. I mean, at some point, yeah, everything's great now, but what happens if, people look and see, hey, England did it. Britain was able to leave and they're fine. They didn't fall into the ocean. Could that potentially start a domino effect? And would the EU or the World Economic Forum, all these organizations, would they even let that happen?
Well, it could. Anything is always possible. The what ifs are always very interesting to talk about, but you can't really know. I think that what will happen is people might want to take a look at this for a year or two or three or 5 or 10 and say, what did happen to Great Britain? What did happen to the UK? What was the final result of this? Remember, Van der Leyen, she's the president of the EU currently, and I give her a tremendous amount of credit. She said, we can always welcome you back. It might be a situation where the British decide we'll go back. We would be better off there. I don't know. If you take a look at the demographics of those who voted for this, most of the people who voted leave were older. Most of the people who voted remain were younger. They were the ones who saw some of these benefits. As those younger ones become middler or older people, they might say, we were a lot better off back then. Let's go back and take a look at that. I don't know. It's hard to say. I'm not a big fan of 5-year plans. It didn't work real well for the Russians. And I don't think that you can I think that you always have to plan economically, individually, your own lifestyle, that sort of thing. But I think that sometimes when we look at we're going to do this. We're not going to sell any electric. We're only going to sell electric cars in Ireland by 2030. And I look at that and I think, nah, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
And I don't like to make statements that I don't think are just about 100% going to come true. I think that when you make a statement and you make a definitive stand, you can very easily get yourself stuck. And then the next time you want to make a statement, people don't believe that one either. Yeah. So I think that we have to take a look, and certainly we have problems in the world. We have problems with environment, problems with obviously COVID, medicine. We have problems with the economies. We have problems with ethnic minorities still. We have racial problems, that sort of thing. But I don't think that we can have these, it's not going to be resolved by one giant treaty any more than it was resolved by the one giant Versailles Treaty.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it seems like that was the main reason to do that, to get them all together, is, you know, to prosper across the whole continent. There, once you know, if everybody's prospering, nobody's angry enough to go after somebody else.
That's the theory.
Yeah, we'll see. So let's bring that down to the country of Ireland here, and we kind of talked about it a little bit, sort of the modern relationship between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Do you see that relationship getting tainted at all because Britain decided to leave?
There are an awful lot of people who think that Brexit will bring about the unification of the North and the South more sooner than it might have happened before. There is a common travel agreement. There's no problem driving back and forth. I'm not exactly sure what kind of problems that there may end up being with regard to products and services and that sort of a thing. There may end up being some. Again, that's not anything of which I'm completely aware. The thing of it is that it was so easy before, from 1998 to 2020. You drove up there, you simply, the only thing that changed was the price of petrol was in dollars and the speed limit. Everything else, I mean, in pounds and the speed limit. Everything else, you went up there and you bought the same things. Went back and forth. People would shop on both sides of the border. People worked on both sides of the border. People took their products to both sides of the border. People sold cattle to both sides of the border. It was completely open. What's going to happen now? I don't know. There have been numbers of articles saying that this is not being sent across the border and that sort of thing. I think the greater problem right now is between Northern Ireland and the UK, Britain itself, but all those things are going to trickle down to people. And what they're also talking about is it's probably going to cost more. Remember, any administration always adds to the price of a product. Whenever you put in rules and regulations, you're adding to the price of the product. So if the price of my pint goes from €6 to €8, I don't like this.
Yeah, and you had mentioned something a few minutes back about, you know, the demographic of of Britain. The younger people potentially may say, hey, you know, maybe we were better off back then. The older folks, more the loyalists to the traditional Britannica, Britannia, you know, that whole thing. Could you say that, or is that the same in Northern Ireland? I mean, is there an undercurrent of people that actually would rather be unified with the rest of Ireland, or is that even a movement, or are we just kind of, that's just a sort of a conversation?
There are more currents in Northern Ireland than there are in the Atlantic Ocean.
Really?
The fact of the matter is, you've got unionists versus nationalists. You've got Catholics versus Protestants. You've got EU people. You've got people who want to stay UK. You've got all these different kinds of things that are going on. I think that realistically, I do think that the younger people up there in the north are more inclined to look at the EU as a great benefit than are some of the older people. The older people, again, are more of the unionist and would want to go back to being having their own sovereignty. That's not across the board, and you have different kinds of ways to go with it. During the vote in Parliament, the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, sided with Theresa May trying to get a deal through Parliament. It didn't work out very well. So there are lots of currents and lots of different influences on what's going to happen. I think that, again, I won't live to see it, but sooner or later, Ireland is going to be unified. And this may bring it about more quickly. Some people are thinking along those lines. But whenever you have people who have thought a certain way for 100 years, it's awful tough to get them to get their heels out of the ground and their heads out of the sand and start moving in a different direction.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because once that domino falls, I'm sure Scotland's next up, and Wales, and
actually Scotland might be first. Scotland wants to be first. Scotland wants to be out now.
I was gonna ask you that, because a couple of years ago, maybe it was right when the whole Brexit thing was announced. Scotland had that. They also had a major vote to decide to stay or not.
Yeah, they did, and it too was a little bit further apart. It wasn't 52-48, but it was like 55-45. It was close.
Yeah.
And Scotland at that time. Now, ever since Brexit has come along, Nicola Sturgeon, who's the Prime Minister of Scotland, has been saying, we want out. We want to go back to the EU. Now, I don't know how you're going to work that. Yeah. Again, take a look at the known unknowns. What do you do with the oil fields that are in the North Sea? Do you go those to Scotland? Do you go those to England? Probably
that's way too much money. Yeah, that's way too much money. That's going to be, England's going to keep those, I'm sure.
Well, how about this one? Where do you think the nuclear submarines are moored?
Yeah,
they're moored in Scotland.
Are they? Yeah.
So when you take a look at these problems and you say, this is not easy. This is not just saying, okay, when Ireland got its independence in 1921, a lot of people said things didn't change very much. That in fact, all they did was they painted the post boxes green instead of red. And in fact, if you look real hard today, you can find some of those 100-year-old post boxes with the crown on them painted over. But this is much different than that. And it's much more difficult than that. Yeah. And I wouldn't hazard a guess as to what would happen in the future.
Yeah. And if history is any indicator, it's times of great upheaval when these sort of tectonic shifts take place. So, I mean, we're, for whatever reason, naively, I thought 2021 was going to be better than 2020. Yeah, it's nuts. It's nuts. So I wanted to ask you real quick, just to talk a little bit about the upcoming book. It sounds like it's going to be coming out towards the end of the year or the second half of the year, called the Terror War. I did want to ask you, because I don't remember if we got into it very much in the first interview. I know we mentioned it, but Bloody Sunday, why was that such a seminal event in the whole War of Independence? Was it because of just a massive scale of the violence, or what was it that?
Well, Bloody Sunday was the 21st of November, 1920. And there were three basic events that happened on Bloody Sunday. In the morning, there were 14 British officers, soldiers, and a civilian who were killed by an Irish hit squad that went out specifically to assassinate them. In the afternoon, there were 14 people who were killed at a GAA, a Gaelic Athletic Association football match in Croke Park. And then later on that night, there were 3 people killed in Dublin Castle, 2 of whom were the brigadier and the vice brigadier of the Dublin Brigade. So you have this massive number of people, 31 people killed within 12 hours. That's number one. Number two, you actually have the combination of all the things and one time that go into the whole war, and it is a terror war. You've got politics, you've got military action, and terror is the idea of creating intimidation and fear in people. You want them to change what they're doing, change their lives. On the very morning of Bloody Sunday, you had these British officers who were intelligence agents killed. The other British agents who were around Dublin, living in private homes at a time, packed their bags, grabbed their families, and ran to Dublin Castle to hide. That's intimidation. That's fear. They're soldiers, they're in uniform, but they were intimidated to get out of where they were and get over here and do something else. If you are a man or a woman going to a GAA football match in the afternoon and you see people being killed in front of you, there's you look at this and you say there's a man named Ned Corcoran who was there that afternoon. And what he said was, as I see this, I never thought I would have seen people get shot. Now when I go to a match and I hear the national anthem and I see the planes above me, it's such a different thing. Intimidation, fear. Do I want to go to a meeting? Do I want to go to a match? Do I ever go to that kind of thing? That's what terror is. Terror is when you make people change the way they live their lives. And it doesn't make any difference if you are a state person or a non-state person, nor does it make any difference if it's a state entity or a non-state entity that creates it. It's this concept of intimidation and fear and changing lives that creates the terror. And the terror does not end at the event. When Ned Corcoran is wondering, do I go back again? It was long after the event at which he was. The trauma lasts forever. The war might end, but the trauma doesn't.
Yeah, and one of the other things, I think you mentioned this in the new book, is you talk about the idea of that terrorist activity usually elicits a response from the governing entity, whatever that is, that's usually overhanded enough that actually starts to change people's minds towards, which side they want to be on in terms of the conflict. And this may be a stretch, but when I was thinking about that, it seems like we're watching that right now. Is there's a reason why they're labeling what happened at the Capitol domestic terrorists. The reason why they throw that word out there, because that elicits a response that potentially could justify them doing something that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to do, or that's so overhanded as to produce the counter or the opposite impact of what they wanted originally. Am I close at all there or no?
Well, terror itself, the word terror elicits a certain response. And terror is often used to define what you did that I don't like. It's not necessarily defined, this is the action, but it's the fact that you did that action and I don't like it. And it also provokes other reprisals. That's one of the concepts of it. When you were in Iraq, there was probably a time when you were seeing people have their heads cut off. That's terror. Yeah. But to whom is this terror directed? Well, it's directed at the United States, certainly. It's directed at your own soldiers, certainly. It's directed at the world, certainly. But it's also directed at your own people, saying, if you mess up, we will cut your heads off too. You have all these audiences to whom the terror is directed. And you can't sit there and say terror is one-sided. What we do, we don't do that, but they do. They do that, but we don't. No. Both sides commit terror, and it's the idea of intimidation and fear. There's an old Chinese proverb of war that says, it's not how many are killed, but it's how many are put into fear. And the fact of the matter is, if you can do that, if you can bring the people over to your other side, then in fact, you intimidate them and you change their lives. In Ireland, for example, when they knew that the black and tans might be coming in 1920, many of the people would just leave. They'd leave their houses. They wouldn't do anything. Because they'd know they'd get burned down. They didn't want any part of it. So the terror preceded the black and tans coming in. On the Irish side, some of the leaders of a town would say to the Irish leaders, if you attack that lorry, the British will come back tonight and burn our homes. So don't attack them. And sometimes the Irish would say, all right, we will not attack them. Terror is when you attack a few and you intend to affect a great many. That's what it does, and it's everywhere. But the concept of terror is the word itself is so pejorative that it doesn't define the act so much as it defines the opinion of the act or the feeling of the act or the result of the act.
That's why it's so popular. That's why it's such a popular tactic, because it works, because it's that primal level that really dictates behavior.
Violence works, terror works. We don't like to admit that. And we don't ever like to say, well, matter of fact, governments will always say, we never negotiate with terrorists. All governments negotiate with terrorists. They may not do it directly, and they may not admit it. And it may be years and years and years later before you find out what it is, but all governments will negotiate with terrorists. Switzerland's diplomatic corps has been known for years to be go-betweens between countries that just would not talk to each other or anything else. United States and Cuba always used the Switzerland's diplomatic corps there in Havana. We always negotiate with terrorists. We don't like to say so. We know terrorism works. We know violence works. A great part of terrorism is that it is political violence that's there to get the result that you want. It's unfortunate. It may not get the result you want, but terrorism and violence does work.
Yeah, yeah, and like we've talked about many times, that's also a very, very fine line, because you can overdo it and screw yourself. You know, you can overdo it to the point where you actually lose support.
One of the terrorists of the 70s was a man by the name of Carlos Maguire. He was a Brazilian, and I'm not sure I didn't call him a terrorist. I think he was a sort of an anarchist, but he had an idea that you come up with an idea, overturn the government, and you get 4 or 5 people and you go rob a bank and you get some money, and then that gets you some guns, and then you go buy some guns and you go rob another bank, you get some more money, and then when you get 10 people, you go ahead and you do this and you start doing this. And he wrote a book, a very small book. It was called the Mini Manual of the Urban Terrorist. And it was a famous book for a while. And I remember somebody saying one time that this was the book that was primarily used by the Baader Meinhof gang. Those were the Red Brigades in Germany. And it's a good thing, too, because the book doesn't work. And so basically, terrorism can go wrong. As I say, it doesn't necessarily cause the result that you want, but it does cause results. And you have to look at it in that particular way. You cannot just dismiss it. And you can't look at it as being binary. We do, they don't. They
Right.
don't, we do. It doesn't work that way.
And one of the other things I wanted to ask you, and this is a little bit more modern Irish history, but I always used to hear growing up I grew up about 25 miles west of Boston, and you always heard about, especially in South Boston where all the Irish lived, you always heard about, in the 80s and kind of back in the heyday when the IRA was real active, you always heard about the bars in Boston always had the tip jar on the counter, that money, the urban myth was that money was going back to Ireland. Is there any truth to that, or is that something that you don't even want to touch on?
Well, if you grew up in that area, you might have seen tip jars there for local orphanages or whatever else, but this wasn't exactly a tip jar. Yeah. And it would have had, the name on the side of this would have been NORAID, NORAID. And it would have been North American Aid for Ireland, and it did go back there, yes. Yeah. And there were many Irish bars throughout the United States, and I know Irish bars in San Francisco, where in fact the jar did not just sit on the bar, the jar was passed around.
Really?
And, yes, and so that money, in fact, went back there. Many of the Irish, even the people in the IRA, discounted that. They thought that they didn't like green, what they sometimes call plastic patties. They looked at it as being people who just sang the old rebel songs, didn't know what was going on, didn't have any idea what it was. But there were many people in Boston who did, in fact, do that. And one of your great alumni from the Boston area was a man by the name of Whitey Bulger.
Oh, yeah.
And Whitey Bulger, who killed a lot of people and finally got in jail and they got killed. But Whitey Bulger actually got a lot of money for weapons and did, in fact, send them over to Ireland. So it did happen. It happened in Ireland. It happened throughout it happened in the United States. It happened throughout the United States. And it was one of the problems that the United States had with regard to the peacetime, because they didn't want to look like they were supporting, some of these people were supporting things that they did not understand what was going on.
Yeah, and that actually, when you just mentioned that, I was thinking that exact same thing. It's the United States, this is happening within the United States. The United States is England's greatest ally. And now you're getting up to the level of the grand chessboard, the grand game of international politics. And that's happening right underneath their noses. It's fascinating.
I mean, when Eamon de Valera came over here to the United States in 1919, spent most of 1919 and all of 1920 in the United States, and he was going around, the British were going crazy, and they kept trying to get the United States to stop him and to send him back, and he had to come over by as a stowaway on ships going both directions. He could not actually go into and out of customs. Same sort of thing happened with Jerry Adams. Remember when Bill Clinton gave Jerry Adams the ability to come over here and gave him a passport, that in a sense legitimatized the Sinn Féin and allowed them to go ahead and continue negotiations. So it's not as though, Brian, history doesn't repeat itself, but you can learn a hell of a lot from history.
Yeah. Oh man, that fascinating stuff. So Joe, the new book is The Terror War. And when did you say, when's that going to be coming out? When can people start buying that? What's the timeline?
Hopefully it'll be November. Fingers crossed again. Get our vaccines, get things starting to open up. I'd like to go over to Ireland in November, get on a lecture tour and that sort of thing. So hopefully it'll be the end of the year. November is the target date. But what I want to do is I want people to take a look. When we look at history, and very often when history is written, it's written not just by the victors. That's the old saying. But it's often written one-sidedly, and we can't let our one-sidedness. We can't let what we want to happen affect our opinions. We should understand that very often history is not binary. It happens on both sides, and we have to take a look at it. We have to give credit to people who have written in times past and said we have to understand exactly what happened, and we have to understand both sides, and we have to understand the trauma suffered by both sides, and sometimes not even just the trauma of those who receive it, but the trauma of those who contribute to it by committing the murders and the assassinations and everything. These people took that with them for the rest of their lives, and a great many of them, whether they were recipients of or participants in the trauma, were terribly, terribly harmed for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. And that's actually a great point. Is the only way not to repeat history is to actually understand it in all of its ugliness, all of its beauty and ugliness. Not one side, but you have to go in with the eyes wide open so you don't make the same mistakes.
Very true. Very, very true.
I love it, sir. This is a pleasure again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so very much for having me. Anytime. Love to talk to you.
All right. Joe Connell, new book coming out. It's called The Terror War. Should be out sometime towards the end of this year. Joe, thank you again very much for your time. I'll leave it like I always do. If you're in the military, the police department, fire department, first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Stay safe. Appreciate everything you do. Joe Connell, thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian.
All right, this is the Rain Man. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.